Okay, it's evening here. I don't know where you are, but look, here's where we're going. We have to cover the revolutions of 1848, but I got to tell you, you can't just go there. Like anything else in history, we have to kind of lead up and blend it into the things that went on before because they had the impetus for what happened in 1848. I also have to add here two other things. One, this is probably going to go into the third week, which is imperialism and colonialization, which is an expansion that comes really after the 1848 and the Crimean War, and it comes about for various reasons. And of course, it's that colonialization and the expansion of the empires, the remaining empires, leads up to World War One. But we'll get to the colonialism and its rationale and the life and other things in colonialism. But I think I'm going to put this one in week 3 also, the revolutions. Why? Well, they're related. Maybe we don't have to go back so far. But here we are. We'll go to the revolutions and their impact, and then what was left. And I think because of this introduction and because of the content, I'll probably have to break it into 2 shorter videos. Well, that's what I'd like to do anyway, so easier on you. All right, well, 1848 is predated, of course, by something we've already talked about, and that's the Congress of Vienna. Congress of Vienna was 1815, after Napoleon's defeat. And the whole purpose of that conglomeration at the defeat of Napoleon was to be sure that France didn't rise again. It was their experience with France, the French Revolution, attacking the monarchy, the absolutist monarchies that existed all over Europe, frightened the bejesus out of the aristocracy and the rulers and the kings and queens and czars and sultans, and then the rise of Napoleon, who managed to then conquer half or more than half, almost all of Europe and a portion of Africa. And so they had to surround France with power to maintain it. And the whole concept behind it was called the balance of power. Now, before I show you the map, there's some significant realities that were not dealt with the settlement of boundaries at the Congress of Vienna. First, well, I don't know, maybe I should put up the map while I speak. I mean, that help you. But first, the divisions, the new territories, the territories carved, added to the Austrian Empire and carved out of France and out of the Napoleonic Empire were done without any consultation or participation or consent of the folks who were affected by those border changes. They were subject to new rulers to whom they had no historical connection, loyalty, or any identification. And new rules and taxes to pay for various things, like the wars that put them in this position, created confusion and anger and resentment. The empires involuntarily, because of their arbitrary division, included diverse ethnic groups, religious groups, and cultures. And this division fueled the concept of nationalism. Nationalism is the perceived right of groups that share something, share a culture, share a language, share ethnicity, share religion, share something they feel, they identify that they have in common, to have a nation state, independent, that they rule. And that idea of nationalism began to grow, especially within the empires, with these folks who didn't have any say in whether they were involved or not. They didn't want to be there necessarily. And so this also fueled the idea of Republican liberalism, which favored some individual rights and freedoms, universal male suffrage, self-determination, and most of all, Adam Smith's laissez-faire economic policies. That signified liberal freedom to a growing middle class. And radical liberals began to develop. Your textbook goes over a whole bunch of them, but obviously the penultimate guy turns out to be Karl Marx. And he argues for redistribution of wealth and a government economy that operates for all folks, socialism. Now, the other thing that this is growing because of that diverse population, okay? Now, that they created, they did it to themselves, in other words, but they firmly established a conservatism and the monarchy as the bulkhead against any of this liberal thought. As a matter of fact, even up and through the development of the U.S. Constitution, the word democracy was a pretty dirty word in politics. It signified to most folks rule by the mob, by the masses, by the uneducated, by the easily swayed, by the ignorant, by the poor, who would be voting for their own benefit and not for the benefit of all. And so even our Constitution, when it was developed, just did not provide for universal suffrage. Males with property. The states decided that, and that's usually what started, and that meant land, not just property. So, democracy was not a big driving force here. But liberalism of sorts, of some civil rights, was, because how can you have a laissez-faire economy and have the freedom to move your capital around and do what you want, borrow money with banks and make a business, if the government owns everything, controls everything? So you can see the alignment of the middle class, merchant class, starting to develop with the poorer have-nots, the peasants or serfs or whatever you want to call them. Workers too, laborers. Now, the last reality is that large empires with diverse populations are difficult to govern. And so to do so, rulers, as a consequence, became more repressive to maintain their position and maintain their control. A little example, in 1813, Great Britain passed the Combination Acts. Combination Acts outlawed unions. Unions were combinations in restraint of free trade, laissez-faire. They repealed laws that protected the guilds or the trades. We didn't discuss guilds, that would be a previous class. History 1, I think it is. But the guilds were what protect the artisans. They set the standards. They set who got in the guild. They set the prices that could be charged for their skilled work. And the Britain repealed any laws protecting the guilds, opening the door to women working, children working. In other words, cheap labor and capitalist goods made to any quality, not governed by the guilds. And therefore driving the skilled worker wages down, which of course upset folks. Now, having done this, the next thing that occurs, of course, is this balance of power that they put in place begins to fray at the edges. Europe begins to split into a liberal West. Great Britain, actually the Netherlands is doing pretty well, and Belgium, which becomes independent, we'll discuss that in a few minutes, is also doing pretty well. In other words, they're becoming industrialized, the middle class is getting very comfortable, there's not much upheaval. Workers are beginning to do better, to benefit, get some benefit from this industrial revolution. But not everywhere. And by the way, France and Great Britain had developed constitutional monarchies. In other words, parliament, representative government had power shared with the monarchy, limited power with the monarchy. And the monarchs in Europe weren't really in favor of that, nor was that a very popular idea in the rest of Central Europe and the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. So here you go. Things start to fray. The Greeks in 1821 attacked every Ottoman Turk they could get their hands on. They were tired of Ottoman Turkish rule. Now, if you look at a map, Turkey is right across the Aegean Sea from Greece. The Turks of the Ottoman Empire retaliated big time. They hung Greek church leaders, sacked, burned Greek churches. They did mass killings of Greek men, and they sold Greek women into slavery. Now, we're getting toward a time where slavery is not very popular in Europe. And so there is a vast outcry and reaction in Europe to these atrocities, if you will. And in 1829, the Greeks rebel, and they are seeking independence. And guess who comes in? The French, the Russians, and the British fleets come and help the Greeks win. As part of the outrage, the public supported that intervention. So the Greeks become independent from the Ottoman Empire. Well, okay, but wait a minute. Wasn't the Ottoman Empire part of what was supposed to encase and keep France weak? But here's the French fighting with the people who are supposed to be watching the French against one of the people in that balance about one of the people, one of the states, governments in that balance of power that was created. Russia took the opportunity to expand its influence by getting recognized by everyone else as protector of the Slavic states from Romania and Bulgaria. Protector, yeah? In other words, sphere of influence. And Russia also took the opportunity to take Constantinople since they were fighting the Turks. Today, Constantinople is Istanbul, and it's probably time to put up the map because then I can show you a couple things. So let's go share. Share. Screen 2. There you go. Now, on the map, and let's see if I'm sharing the screen, there's Istanbul. You'll see the isthmus here. As a matter of fact, this little division is called the Bosphorus. And on this side of the Bosphorus is Europe. You cross the Bosphorus, there's actually a bridge there today. Cross that bridge, and halfway across, you're in Asia. It is also the access to the Black Sea and all Russia. So the Bosphorus controls access from all this area around here into the Mediterranean Sea and ultimately out to the Atlantic Ocean. So Russia wanted this access. And so they took it. Now these slashed parts here show the expanded territory taken from Napoleon's conquests. And there's more here showing territory taken from France. They're very dark. It's hard to see them. Taken from France. Note Geneva, Switzerland is almost in there. And then we go up to the top and you have Luxembourg and Belgium, others. You can see some significant territory taken from France. Italy is not a country. It's various, as you see, various segments. It's got kingdoms up here, the Lombardy and the Veneto kingdom, the Tuscany, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of the Sicilies down here. It's not till the 1800s, and we'll get to it, that Italy becomes united. Similarly with Germany, the German Confederation. It's merely a confederation of kingdoms, and you see the names. All right, I think that kind of illustrates things for you. Look at the size of the Russian Empire. And they took Poland, or a good chunk of Poland, much to the Polish chagrin. Notice, for our purposes today, Ukraine doesn't exist. It's in the Russian Empire. So as you can see, that Vienna, Congress of Vienna, created or set the stage for a whole new set of problems. So yeah, Russia takes Constantinople, and because Russia is now kind of moving around and saying, flexing its muscles, its power is growing. By 1825, Nicholas I had suppressed any dissent in Russia. He was an absolute monarch ruler, and he established Section 3 of his police, the secret police, which spied on everybody. Now, to avoid war, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, which was one of the German states, the most powerful German state, Kingdom of Prussia, allowed Belgium to become independent on the condition that it remain neutral. In other words, hang out and stay between us and France, but don't take sides. Now, the Russian serfdom was still the basic social institution, and 90% of its population remained agrarian, living off the land, mostly subsistence farming. But so Russia had a growing population because the ag land was producing stuff, and it wanted to expand its growing population in ag land, arable, usable land. Remember, a lot of northern Russia is tundra. It's perma ice, especially in those days. It's changing today, but perma ice. Yeah, it's tough to grow anything. So they wanted warmer, little warmer climates and wanted to move south. And so they did. They entered an agreement with the Turks to be protector of the Christian shrines within the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Very nice of the Ottomans. But of course, problems arise, right? Whenever you make an agreement like that, it's bound to cause some other trouble. You let somebody else in your country have some say in what's going on in your borders. And that is a dispute between Russian Orthodox and Catholics in Jerusalem in the Ottoman Empire occurred. And France, of course, being heavily Catholic, jumped in on the side of France, which caused Russia to jump in on the side of the Orthodox. And here we are. Where's that balance of power going? So you have former allies against France fighting with France. Individually, not with the alliance, not with the alliance. Not to mention this fact, Nicholas then, France then allies with the Turks against Russia. Wait a minute. The Ottoman Empire and Great Britain and Russia were all to encircle France. Now, France is making treaties with members of the group that is supposed to be controlling France, keeping it from becoming too mean and big and nasty and powerful like it did under Napoleon, to keep it from spreading those revolutionary ideas of the French Revolution. It's cracking. It's cracking. So French allied with the Turks against the Russians, and Great Britain was against any change in the balance of power. Now, this jumps a little bit past 1848. But you can see that what's cracking. And in 1848, a lot more cracked. But these alliances really end up with what's called the Crimean War in 1853 through 1856. And that's the Ottomans, France, and Great Britain, joined by the Sardinians, which is another one of those provinces in northern Italy. Joined to fight Russia, Russia's expansion. So the realignment of the Allies is complete. Russia's out. You haven't heard of the Germans or the Austrians. And the Ottomans, France, and Great Britain are now aligned against one of their former allies in that balance of power, Russia. Russia pushed the limits and entered the Balkans with an intent to claim them, and suffered a decisive defeat. The Turks, because the Balkans were part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turks declared war on Russia. And France and Great Britain, for the reasons I stated, joined. Now, the defeat by Russia was really traumatic for Russia. I mean, they didn't think they would lose. They lost big, and they lost, I don't know how to say it, decisively. Decisive defeat. And Russia understood then that it had vastly underestimated where it was in this industrialization race and mobilization. It created great hardship on the peasants of Russia, which then the ideologies, the liberal ideologies, especially the radical ones, began to take hold. And there was a real threat of a massive uprising of some 20 million peasants in Russia, which caused Tsar Alexander II to institute some social reforms to try and stave that off. But he also engaged in a lot of modernization efforts, such as railroad building and farm techniques, which allowed Russia to actually export grain and eventually join the industrial race. And it made money from its exports, grain exports, to continue industrialization. Out of that Crimean War, we saw the first use of some modern weapons, machine guns and cannons with shells, not cannonballs, had been developed, which changed the face of war again. The telegraph was used for the first time. Timely, in this context, timely news from the front. It was covered by the newspapers. And we had Florence Nightingale revolutionize medicine. We talked about that with the revolution in medicine. And out of this came that famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. But what really came out of it was a very weakened Russia. Now, in 1848, before this war started, there was an awful lot happening in Central Europe. Now, to be clear, Great Britain, Netherlands, and Belgium managed to kind of stay out of the 1848 phrase, as did Russia, really. It managed to avoid them being as poor as it was, and so did the Ottoman Empire, also being poor and not industrialized to the extent of the other European countries who were attempting to catch up with Great Britain. Now, if you're wondering where America is in all this, by the 1850s, you're talking about the Missouri Compromise, bloody Kansas, the fight over slavery, and the Dred Scott decision, and we're cruising toward civil war. In other words, we're not players in any of this. We got our own house in disorder. So the revolutions of 1848, there was so much happening. We just have to do a summary, and you have to rely on your text for much more. Before I go into the details, we'll take a look at the overall picture here. The destruction by now, this contributed to the destruction of the balance of power envisaged by the Congress of Vienna and led to or contributed to the Crimean War. In the 1840s, Europe was plagued by bad crops. And I have another picture to show you that I should have put up. Where did it go? Ooh. Already. There we go. Find it right away now. Bad crops in the, there it is. Bad crops in the 1840s. And it's a series of them. And I think you've probably heard of the Irish famine. Well, that was 1843, 4, 5, 7, and 8, something like that. Maybe 4, 5, 7, and 8. There was one decent crop in the middle of that, but 1847 was their worst year. And part of the reason for those bad crops was a blight, potato blight. And I have a picture of a potato suffering from potato blight. And there it is. You can take a look at it and you can see you don't want to eat that. It was indeed rotten. And so this destroyed potatoes throughout, but also since Irish were heavily dependent on it for their diet, caused severe famine in many places, most particularly in Ireland. So much so Ireland lost about half its population. Hundreds of thousands to emigration. They went to the United States and to the rest of other places in Europe, and hundreds of thousands to starvation and disease. The uneven development of industry in Europe had left folks that had been kicked off their lands. Remember the enclosures when they went from tenant farming to wool for sheep because it was so valuable? Land use was changed. Well, that happened in other places in Europe also as folks industrialized. Folks were kicked, and other folks left the land to go work in the cities, urbanization, to make more money. Not everybody, land is a finite thing. So even if you owned a big farm, if you had 6 kids, you divide it up 6 times. Now each one of them has 6 kids. What happens to the land? How much land can you inherit or hand down? How much in little Europe is available compared to, say, the Americas, which we haven't talked much about yet? And so the living conditions in the city were horrible, to say the least, less than satisfactory, if I was being nice. But so they became a hotbed. Cities became hotbeds of the spread of radical liberal ideologies. And so we saw liberals demanding written constitutions, representative government, greater civil rights, and conservative monarchies violently resisting any of these changes. Now, the radicals, as I said, there was a union with laissez-faire, want some freedom, economic middle classes that were developing with this industrialization also. And so this hotbed saw this rise in demands for civil rights, representative governments, constitutions. What the constitutions would do was limit the power of the monarchs to take property, to kick people off property, to be absolute monarchs, in other words. Give your property to somebody else because you weren't loyal, whatever. Okay, now that sets up the 1840s, 1848. Those are the conditions in Europe. I'm going to continue what happened in 1848 and show you the chaos and its effects in the next presentation.